been trying to think how best to characterise my work over the past 2 decades and came up with a couple of ideas. One is that I'm interested in the way we live now, to borrow Trollope's famous formulation. The other is that I'm interested in the language that we and the people who came before us used to express ourselves. It may seem a little strange for a writer who has written so many novels set in the past to profess an interest in the present, but to me there seems no clear distinction. We are what history has made us. I should add that I didn't set out to become a historical novelist as such, but have simply followed my inclinations as to place and time. I suppose my first novel is my most contemporary, at least as far as its setting, Edinburgh in the late 1970s, is concerned. A Mild Suicide is a rather tangled love story with a self-consciously literary feel, since my characters, all postgraduate students at Edinburgh University, can't seem to avoid drawing parallels between their experiences and things they've read in books, a not uncommon tendency amongst those who've studied English literature, I've found. In my second novel, Undiscovered Country, I found myself moving further back in time, to the 1950s, and exploring a theme which has become a central concern in my work, war and its effect on the lives of those caught up in it. The story is set in Venezuela and concerns a group of English, American and Dutch expatriates living in one of the oilfield settlements near Lake Maracaibo. All these people are, in one way or another, trying to escape the past, which is of course the surest way of ensuring that it continues to haunt them. In this novel and others, I've looked at the way that people's lives have been shaped by war. Even my black comedy Fabulous Time, which was the novel I published next, has a war theme running through it, in this instance the First World War, although it wasn't until the book after that, The Dark Tower, that war became a central theme. This novel was set in South Africa during the Anglo-Zulu Wars of the late 1870s, and I had a great deal of fun exploring not only the landscape of that extraordinary but troubled country, but those aspects of 19th century warfare which had until then been something of a mystery to me: the weaponry, military uniforms, provisioning and equipment necessary for an army on the move. And this was just the start. In order to write about what the Zulu War was like, not just for the British soldiers who fought in it, but for those against whom they were fighting, to say nothing of those, that is the women, left behind at home, I had to immerse myself in the period. As well as reading and rereading all the late 19th century novels I could get my hands on, I spent a great deal of time in the British Library, reading accounts, some of them first-hand, of what had happened on the battlefields. Having acquired a taste for such research, I set my next novel, Variable Stars, even further in the past. However, I must confess that even though the work has a variety of foreign settings, including Hanover, Groningen and Brussels, I seldom left my desk at the Royal Astronomical Society Library, because by this time the travelling I was doing was time travelling, piecing together from contemporary documents a sense of what the 18th century past was like. Variable Stars is about the astronomer Caroline Herschel, born in 1750, who was the first professional female astronomer and whose gold medal for services to astronomy is to be found in the archives of my old college, Girton. She was the sister of William Herschel, who discovered the planet Uranus and thus doubled the size of the known universe, and she herself discovered a number of comets and other astronomical objects during her long and illustrious career. As a novelist rather than a biographer, I was interested in Caroline Herschel, the private woman rather than the public figure. As well as chronicling her remarkable achievements, I wanted to know how she looked, what she wore, how she felt. I wanted to know, in effect, what it was like to be Caroline Herschel. I was given some help in this endeavour by Caroline herself, since in addition to her scientific journals, she wrote an autobiography of her early life. But even this first-hand material, fascinating as it was, had to be used with circumspection. It wasn't enough to simply reproduce what Caroline had said about herself. I had to offer something more in the way of insight. The fact that Caroline destroyed 10 years' worth of her journals soon after her brother's marriage in 1788 gave me my opportunity. A novelist can fill in the gaps, as it were, between the known facts and offer speculations not available to the biographer. And so to my most recent book, Line of Sight, which is set in the late 1920s. It's a period in which I have been interested for a very long time, since I was an undergraduate at Girton College, in fact, writing my dissertation on the novels of Wyndham Lewis. It's rather gratifying to think that all that research wasn't wasted, and that several decades on I've been able to incorporate some of it into a detective story. In doing so, I've tried to convey not only the things essential to any whodunit, character, setting, motive, but a sense of the way people looked and behaved, and also the way they spoke. because the period often referred to as between the wars is still just within living memory. Its preoccupations seem so close to our own, and yet the language people used and the way they behaved, even in moments of high emotion, was very different from that of the present day. This may seem as if it should go without saying, but it's surprising how often these subtle differences are overlooked in, say, television dramas ostensibly set in the 1920s and often wonderfully accurate as to the clothes, cars and country houses of the period, but which nevertheless adhere to a jarringly 21st century idiom. The central character of Line of Sight is Frederick Rowlands, a veteran of the Ypres battlefields, whose life has been irrevocably changed by this experience. Now working as a telephonist for a firm of city solicitors, Fred is caught up in a situation outside his control when he overhears a conversation between his employer and former commanding officer, and the woman with whom both are more than a little in love. From this point on, things become increasingly convoluted as Fred struggles to make sense of the lies and half-truths to which, as a professional eavesdropper, he is privy. As a switchboard operator, Fred listens in to others' conversations as a matter of course. That he doesn't always get things right is no reflection on his intelligence, but says something about the way we're all trying as readers, as interpreters of our experience, to understand the world from the often partial or imperfect information that comes our way. That the novel had to be a detective story only became clear to me midway through the writing of Line of Sight. As soon as it did, a lot of other things fell into place. Detective fiction reached its zenith as an art form in the so-called Golden Age between the wars, although of course fine examples of the genre continue to be written by Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers, Marjorie Allingham and others well beyond the end of the Second World War. But for my purposes it was the murder mysteries of the late 1920s and early 1930s which gave me the flavour of the times. And what extraordinary times they were. This was a world at once deeply conventional and, at least in some quarters, startlingly radical, politically, sexually and culturally. It was a time of high unemployment, with many factories, once devoted to the making of munitions, closing down at the end of the war, and tens of thousands of wounded and disabled men returning from the battlefields to find they were virtually unemployable. Across Europe there were strikes in the coal, steel and shipbuilding industries. The general strike of 1926 was only the culmination of a period of extreme social inequality and violent unrest. Most of the research for the novel was done at the London Library. I do like to vary my libraries, but I did make a research trip to Ypres, where my protagonist, a field gunner, whose biography bears more than a passing resemblance to that of my grandfather, was wounded in 1917. So although this isn't specifically a First World War novel, it does make reference to the war and its aftermath. Indeed, its theme might be said to be the effects that war has on those who've had the luck, or perhaps misfortune, to survive it. Once again, my reading of works written at the time gave me the tone and resonance I was looking for. In addition to the novels and poetry of the period, there were memoirs by former combatants and those who'd served as medical staff, such as Colonel Robert J. Blackman's splendidly titled Scalpel, Sword and Stretcher, and Vera Britton's moving account of her experiences as a VAD, Testament of Youth. The London Library also houses a complete collection of the Times newspaper from 1750 to the present day, and so increasingly as my research for the novel went on, I found myself in its archives leafing through yellowing copies of the paper in search of the details which would give authenticity to my story. In the Times columns for 1927, the year in which Line of Sight is set, one still found lists of those killed in action, placed there each year by grieving relatives in commemoration of those they had lost. In the edition for 17th of June, to take just one example, can be found a memorial notice for Second Lieutenant Harold James Deller of the Royal Field Artillery, killed in action on the Ypres salient, aged 20. Here too is Second Lieutenant Edward Rogers of the Somerset Light Infantry, killed at Ypres, aged 23, and Francis Ritson, Captain, Dorsetshire Regiment, killed in action at Messines Ridge, aged 29. Even after almost a decade, it is apparent that few households had remained untouched by the war. Even those who had not lost sons, brothers and fathers would have been all too aware of the catastrophic effects such losses had had on the workforce. No less poignant than the memorial notices placed there by the bereaved are the advertisements placed by ex-servicemen seeking work. Good appearance, excellent references, anything considered. But in spite of this underlying note of heartbreak and loss, life had to go on. At Peter Jones' department store on the 17th of June 1927, they were selling dainty gowns of figured georgette with accordion pleated panels at 6 guineas, and delightful gowns of crepe de chine finished at the waist with a buckle of diamante for 8 guineas. A Persian lamb fur coat would set you back the not inconsiderable sum of 45 guineas, while you could buy yourself a pair of finest lizard skin shoes for 32 and 9p. As for entertainment, you could take yourself to see Rookery Nook at the Aldwych, Lady Luck at the Carlton, or the Desert Song at Drury Lane. If those seemed too tame, you could down a couple of cocktails and then enjoy the latest Charles Cochrane review at the Pavilion Theatre, with the racy title of One Damn Thing After Another. This was an era when there were no mobile phones, no televisions, and not very many motor cars, when few households had telephones and quite a number were without inside lavatories. Central heating was unknown except for the rich, who of course were the only ones able to afford the other amenities of modern life we now take for granted, such as refrigerators, washing machines, and vacuum cleaners. Not that most of these well-to-do people expected to do their own household chores, even in the late 1920s, with many who had once worked in service preferring to earn their livings in factories or shops. The front pages of the Times for this period are full of advertisements for housemaids, must be good-tempered, cook generals, good references essential, and between maids, titled family, 4 servants kept, as well as those for chauffeurs, butlers and gardeners. But all this research, enjoyable as it was to do, could only be part of the picture. Without my characters to bring the story to life, such details were no more than window dressing. Which brings me back to my opening remarks about the importance for a writer of keeping in mind the way we live now. In writing about the past, one is always looking at it through the lens of the present. I can't say strongly enough that I'm not interested in writing literary pastiche. There are far too many good novels about the interwar years that were published at the time for me to want to do that. My books, although concerned with the past, are written from a present-day perspective. By this I mean that they offer ways of looking at past events and of thinking about them, perhaps not available to people at the time. In writing Line of Sight, I felt myself to be both drawn into the world I was researching and standing a little outside it, noticing its similarities to our own world, but also its profound dissimilarities. As I've tried to show in these past few minutes, a writer trying to create an authentic sense of this or any other historical era must pay particular attention to the language of the times. The best way of doing this is through reading. This needn't be confined solely to the literature of the period, but could include contemporary documents, letters, journals, court reports, newspaper reports, even shopping lists. All of these will give you a real sense of how people thought, how they spoke, how they loved, which when you're trying to create a sense of the way they lived then can only be of value. By itself, research doesn't necessarily make a better novel, but it does give you, the writer, a better understanding of the times about which you are writing, and that, for this writer at least, is a large part of what one hopes to get out of it.